Hello and welcome. Tonight, we won't be exploring the mind of a philosopher or diving into deep debates. And we won't be stepping onto a battlefield the way movies show it either. No glittering jewels, no slow-motion horse charges, and definitely no spotless armor. Instead, we'll drift into something more real, more human, into silence between sounds, into dust, cold, and the fog of memory, into what could have been just an ordinary night in a forgotten past. So, find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and if this moment resonates with you, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly speaks to you. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always a quiet wonder to see who's out there with us. Now, close your eyes and let the story begin. It was a cold night when Einar, the Silent Viking, stared into the dark sea. The wind, ever restless, whispered through the cliffs like an ancient song, one that only those who had lived many winters could understand. Snow drifted from the black sky in slow, spiraling patterns. Einar stood at the edge of the world, where land gave way to ocean and memory, where time moved slower and thoughts grew deeper. He had come here every evening for months. The path to the cliffs was worn only by his boots, a silent trail carved through snow and moss and time. No one followed him. They knew better to break the silence he kept. His stillness was sacred now. Einar the warrior, who once roared louder than storms, was now the quietest voice in the village and the most revered. The sea rolled gently tonight, its surface like obsidian cloth stirred by invisible hands. It reminded him of something, or perhaps someone, but the memory lived only in sensation now, not in name. He inhaled deeply, salt, cold pine. A hint of ash still lingered from the longhouse fires behind him. He lowered himself to the cold stone bench that faced the ocean. This bench had no name, yet every elder had known it, the elders before them too. Einar pressed his palm against the rock, grounding himself. The stone held the day's warmth, but only barely. It would cool completely soon, like everything else. He was not old in years, not yet, but life had weathered him like sea against shore, softly at first, then relentlessly. The raids had ended. The long ships were docked for good. His sword rested in its sheath untouched beneath his bed. And now all that remained were the echoes. There had been glory once, firelit halls, golden mead, laughter that shook the beams of the great longhouse. There had been voices raised in chants, feet pounding in dances, stories spun around like thread around a spindle. There had been battles, fierce and brutal and necessary, and brothers, so many brothers. But now there was quiet, and it was not unwelcome. The night wrapped itself around Einar like a familiar cloak. Above, the stars blinked open one by one, scattered across the sky like embers lost in the void. He had once believed they were the eyes of gods, watching, judging. Now he thought them more like witnesses, silent and endless. He shifted slightly on the stone. The snow didn't bother him. He barely noticed the cold anymore. It had become part of him, like his silence. It was not the silence of fear, nor of sorrow. It was the silence of someone who had seen much, said much, and now listened. He listened to the sea. It hummed its lullaby in tones too deep for human voices. Waves met the rocks in soft percussion, a steady rhythm older than songs. Sometimes in this hush, he imagined the sea speaking to him, not in words, but in feelings. Sometimes sorrow, sometimes peace. A light flickered behind him, the longhouse. The others would be sleeping soon. He saw a figure cross the doorway, probably little Solveig, the baker's daughter. She liked to sneak honey cakes before bedtime. Einar smiled slightly. He had taught her to fish once when the river thawed. She had fallen in and emerged laughing, covered in weeds and laughter. He wondered if she'd remember that when she was old. Einar ran his hand across the runes carved into the bench. They told no coherent story, just fragments, names, symbols. He traced one he recognized, his brother's, Bjorn. The name burned hotter than any fire. Bjorn who had gone with him to the Western Isles. Bjorn who never returned. The fog of memory thickened around him, not sharp like grief, but soft like wool. He had stopped asking why. The gods took whom they wished, when they wished. All that remained now was remembrance. A raven croaked from the pine above him. It rustled its feathers and flew off into the dark. He watched it go, a black shape against a black sky. They said ravens carried messages to the Allfather. Einar hoped this one would carry peace. He lay back, slowly, on the bench. Snow fell into his beard, cold and gentle. He watched the stars move. The fire inside his heart burned low but steady, and still the sea sang. He remembered the old tales, how the world began in ice and fire, how men came from ash trees, how each soul had a thread in the loom of fate. He imagined that thread, his own, weaving quietly now, no longer pulled tight in tension, but resting. He thought of warmth, of mead, of his mother's hands braiding his hair when he was still a child. He thought of the first time he saw the sea, wide-eyed and small, his father's hand gripping his shoulder. He thought of his dog, Thorley, who once chased a hare into the woods and returned 3 days later with a limp and a proud look.
She passed a pool of water, still as glass. It reflected the fading sky, the first stars, and her own soft silhouette. She paused and knelt beside it. With one hand, she disturbed the surface, watching as the ripples danced outward. What stories lived in the reflection? Her thoughts wandered, as they often did at this hour. She remembered being a child, barefoot and wild, running through the dunes with sand clinging to her hair and laughter in her lungs. Her grandmother had brought her to the temple when she was only 9. "The moon calls to you," she had said. "Can you hear it?" She hadn't then, but she did now. Every night when the rest of the world grew quiet and the winds softened, the moon would rise over the eastern cliffs. It came slowly, with patience, as if reluctant to disturb the world's slumber. And when it appeared, silver and full and gentle, Leora would light the lanterns and walk the sacred paths. She did not know why the temple still stood. There were no more cities nearby. No pilgrims came, no offerings were left. The world had forgotten this place, but she remembered. And perhaps that was enough. The sound of wind chimes stirred her from her thoughts. They hung above the northern gate, strung with crystal and bone. Each chime held a name. Some had been there for centuries, others she had added herself. She walked to them now, reaching up to steady one that had twisted in the breeze. Her fingers brushed the tiny etchings. She whispered a name, not out loud, just in her heart. Then she smiled and continued. The inner sanctum lay at the heart of the temple. Few had entered it. Even Leora did not go there every night. It was not a place of ritual. It was a place of remembering, of deep listening. She stopped just before the carved arch that led inside. Tonight, she would not enter. Tonight, she would walk the outer rings as the old guardians once did. Her fingers trailed along the symbols carved into the walls, phases of the moon, constellations long forgotten, stories told in silver and stone. She lit a lantern, its soft flame dancing within the wind glass, then another, and another. She walked slowly, lighting each one as she passed. With every flame, a memory returned, a name, a story, a prayer long since whispered into dust. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply walked and remembered. The path led her to the temple's eastern edge, where the ground fell away into a wide expanse of dunes. The moon was rising now, slowly, majestically. It cast a silver light across the sand, turning every grain into a shimmer of starlight. The desert, vast and silent, seemed to exhale. She sat upon the final stone step, her lantern beside her. She placed her hands on her knees and closed her eyes. Breath in, breath out. The sound of wind through stone, the hush of sand shifting in the distance, the thrum of her heartbeat perfectly in sync with the moon. She let go of names, let go of stories, let go of time. In this moment, there was only stillness, not emptiness, never that, but fullness without noise, a presence that needed no language. The moon reached its zenith, and Leora, the silent guardian, remained in its glow, breathing, listening, remembering, waiting. The night deepened. The sky above the desert transformed into a tapestry of stars, endless and hushed. Constellations that had been forgotten by the world beyond the dunes still danced in their ancient patterns here. The great serpent, the archer of the south, the crescent weaver, all etched into the heavens with precision only time could sustain. Leora opened her eyes. The moonlight bathed the stones around her, revealing details often invisible by day. Tiny lichens in the cracks of the marble, carvings worn smoothed by the breath of centuries, crystals embedded in the walls that shimmered faintly under the lunar glow. She rose to her feet with practiced grace, her movements fluid, like water flowing over stone. The wind played with the hem of her robe, tugging gently, as if asking her to dance. She smiled and began to walk again, this time not with duty, but with wonder. She passed the Hall of Whispers, an ancient chamber carved into the rock, where voices of the past still echoed in hushed tones. No one spoke there now, yet if one stood very still, it was said the walls would tell stories, not with words, but with feeling. Leora had stood there many times in silence. She had never heard words exactly, but she had felt them, deep, stirring impressions that rose from the stone itself. Regret, joy, loneliness, hope. It was as if the temple remembered every soul who had passed through its gates, and in remembering, it offered comfort. She touched the wall gently, letting her palm rest there. It was warm, not with heat, but with presence.
She left the chamber quietly and descended a spiral staircase that led to the lower terraces. Few ventured here, even when the temple had been full of life. The wind was stronger, and the walls were more broken. Time had crept into these places more boldly. Still, it was not decay, it was change, honest and slow. At the base of the stairs lay the moon garden. It was not large, just a patch of stone bordered by ivy and sand. At its center, a tree grew. It was old, perhaps the oldest thing in the temple. Its bark was smooth like skin, and its branches stretched wide, as if embracing the night. The tree only bloomed once a month, when the moon was full, and tonight it was in bloom. Tiny white blossoms clung to the branches like stars caught in a web. Their scent was delicate, almost shy. Leora approached slowly and placed her hand on the trunk. She bowed her head. "This night, I remember you." She did not name the you. It was not necessary. The moon knew. The garden held stones around its perimeter, each marked with a symbol: peace, renewal, courage, sorrow. Leora sat beside the one marked silence. It had always been her favorite. Silence was not emptiness. It was fullness without sound, a way of hearing what would otherwise be missed. She sat still. She breathed. Above her, petals drifted from the branches, carried by a wind that had no name. They landed in her hair, on her robes, on the ground. She did not move to brush them away. The desert stretched beyond the temple in all directions, soft, dark waves of sand under a moonlit sky. Somewhere, far off, a jackal cried. The sound echoed like a memory too fragile to hold. Leora closed her eyes once more. She remembered the faces of those who had come before. Some had worn robes like hers. Others had come barefoot, uninvited, simply drawn by a dream. There had been warriors, poets, wanderers, orphans, lovers. Each had left something behind, an offering, a story, a piece of their soul. And the temple had kept them all. Sometimes she wondered what would happen when she too was gone. Would another guardian come? Or would the temple finally be alone? She was not afraid of that thought. Even if no one remained, the moon would still rise. The tree would still bloom. The stones would still hum their meanings to the wind. She looked upward. The moon was beginning to descend now, tracing its arc slowly toward the western hills. It had reached its peak. Soon it would return to shadow. But the night was not yet over. She rose once more, lifting her lantern from the stone. The flame flickered inside, steady and golden. With it, she walked the edge of the garden, her shadow trailing behind her like a thread. Each step brought her closer to the gate of breath, a threshold carved into the stone at the far end of the temple grounds. It was said that dreams entered through this gate and left the same way, fluttering like birds into the minds of sleepers across the desert. She passed beneath it. The world felt different on the other side. Not darker, not colder, just deeper. The sand here was untouched by wind. It lay perfectly still, as if time itself held its breath. She walked barefoot, leaving no footprints. At the center of this forgotten space lay a circle of standing stones, 13 of them, each marked with a phase of the moon. Leora stepped into the circle and set the lantern in the very center. Its light glowed against the stones, casting long curved shadows that moved with the flame. She sat within the circle, crossed her legs, folded her hands, and waited. This was the final ritual of the Guardian. Not a prayer, not a song.
Just presence, the act of being here, alive, aware, connected. She felt her heart beat once, then again, then slower, until it moved in rhythm with the light of the moon. The sands whispered secrets in a language only she could feel. She was part of the temple, and the temple was part of her. The silence stretched on. It was not an emptiness, but a fullness that cradled Leora in its arms, a quiet so vast that it erased the edges of her thoughts. Her breath was steady. The world around her no longer moved forward or backward. There was only now. Only this moment beneath the moon. The circle of stones shimmered faintly under the moonlight. They seemed taller somehow, more ancient, as if they remembered the times before the temple even stood. Leora leaned back gently, resting against the sand, eyes fixed upward at the endless dome of stars. She was not seeking anything. She simply watched. The sky above held constellations not found in any scroll. She had never learned their names. Some of them she had named herself: the Weaver's Needle, the Silent Bridge, the Eye of Water. Each night she traced them again and again, as one might follow the lines of a sacred text. But unlike words, these stars never changed. They did not lie. They simply were. The moonlight softened. Its brilliance mellowed into a calm silver, like a breath after tears. A hush began to fall over the land. Not the hush of emptiness, but the hush of everything listening at once. Leora's hand found a stone buried in the sand beside her. She lifted it, brushing the sand away. It was warm to the touch, and there were markings, worn but familiar. She remembered it now. She had carved it herself many years ago, her first offering as guardian. The symbol was simple. 2 crescent moons touching, creating a full one between them. Balance. She placed the stone gently in her lap and closed her eyes again. Within her mind, she walked once more through the temple halls. She saw herself as a child, chasing shadows along the corridors, giggling when she shouldn't. She saw her grandmother, hair as white as the moon, gently correcting her posture, guiding her hands in ritual.
She saw the acolytes who had once trained beside her, long gone now, scattered like dust into time. Then she saw the others, those who had come to the temple not to stay, but to rest, to weep, to breathe. A warrior, bloodied but gentle, a mother who had lost her child to the fever winds, a poet silenced by grief who had sat beside the pool until words returned. She had seen them all, held their hands, watched their pain dissolve in moonlight. And now, there was no one, only her and the moon. That was enough. A cool breeze passed over her, lifting strands of her hair. She exhaled slowly, letting the wind carry her thoughts into the desert. Far, far away, over the dunes, across time itself. Leora rose slowly, her joints aching slightly, but not unkindly. She carried the small carved stone to the base of one of the standing monoliths. There was a small alcove there, a cradle for memories. She placed the stone within it, nestled between two others whose stories had long faded. Then she bowed, not to the stone, not to the moon, but to the act of remembering. She took up her lantern again and walked the long, winding path back through the sands. The gate welcomed her without sound. The garden waited for her beneath the blooming tree. The blossoms had begun to fall more heavily now, covering the stones like snow. She stood beneath the tree for a long time. Its petals brushed her skin as they fell, cool and soft. Each one a story, each one a goodbye. Back inside the temple, she extinguished the lantern. The flame died with a soft puff, and the shadows returned to their places on the walls. She moved through the corridors slowly, reverently, as though walking through the pages of an old sacred book. In her private chamber, she lit a single candle and sat on the floor beside her bedroll. Her room was bare, a low shelf, a folded blanket, a bowl of water, a woven mat. The candlelight flickered softly, painting long shapes on the walls. She whispered her final prayer, not to the moon, but to the silence. Let me remember what the world forgets. Then she lay down. The wind outside grew calmer. The petals continued to fall. And Leora, the last guardian of the moon temple, drifted into sleep. Not hurriedly, not fearfully, but with the peace of someone who knows her place in the great stillness of things. The moon lingered a little longer in the sky, as if watching over her, as if, in some way, it too remembered. It was a cold morning when Alden, the old shepherd, opened the wooden door of his stone cottage and stepped into the mist. The fog was thick and gentle, curling around his boots as if greeting an old friend. It rolled down the slopes and pooled in the valleys like milk spilled across the hills. The sky was pale and quiet, holding its breath before the sun dared rise. Alden inhaled deeply. The scent of moss, smoke, and damp earth filled his lungs, steadying him in a way that years of solitude had only deepened. He leaned slightly on his crooked staff, carved from a storm-felled birch tree many winters ago, and listened. Far below, in the folds of the hills, the soft clinking of bells rang out like distant memories. The flock was still moving. Good. The sheep knew the rhythm of these mountains better than any map could describe. Alden took a slow step forward,
his boots finding the familiar path by touch rather than sight. The trail was old, carved not by tools but by feet, hoof, paw, boot, barefoot, across generations. It wound past ancient stone walls and low brush, across streams and through groves of pine and ash. He did not need to see it. His bones remembered it. He passed the old willow tree, its branches sagging with mist. Here, long ago, his daughter used to sing to the lambs. Her voice, soft and curious, had blended with birdsong in the spring. That was before she left for the valley below, where villages breathed fire and metal and the hum of too many voices. He did not blame her. Some are called to the world, others are called to the silence between the clouds. And Alden had always belonged to the mist. He reached the first overlook, a broad ledge of stone that jutted from the mountainside. On clear days he could see the river sparkle far below, winding like a silver thread through fields of green. But today there was only white, a soft, shifting white that held the world in pause. He sat. The stone was damp beneath him, but he didn't mind. He reached into the folds of his wool cloak and drew out a small loaf of bread and a wedge of sharp cheese wrapped in cloth. He ate slowly, methodically, as he did each day, chewing not just the food, but the moment. Somewhere nearby, a raven cawed once, then was silent. The bells rang again, closer now. The flock would be making its way toward the eastern slope. They moved slowly in this fog, and Alden preferred it that way. Fast things broke. Fast lives faded. He sipped water from a tin cup and closed his eyes. Let the mist pass. Let the day begin without hurry. Let the silence speak. He remembered when the mountains were louder, when his father shouted instructions down the valley, when the dogs barked and chased the herd in wide, swirling arcs,
when the thunder of hooves meant urgency, storms, wolves, or both. But those days had quieted with age. The dogs were gone. The herd was smaller now, more patient. And Alden no longer shouted. He simply listened. He rose, brushing crumbs from his cloak. The wind shifted faintly, curling upward from the ravine below, bringing with it the scent of heather and old stone. He turned westward and began his descent. The path dipped and rose, hugging the curves of the hills like an old lover. Stones jutted up through moss, trees bent low with moisture. The forest here was not thick, but old, full of gnarled trunks and branches that whispered in the fog. Alden walked slowly, not from weakness, but from reverence. Every tree was a memory. Every rock had once been sat upon. Every bend in the trail was a page from the book of his life. He reached the pasture as the mist began to thin, revealing woolly shapes grazing lazily across the slope. His sheep, 27 of them, moved like ghosts through the grass. Each wore a bell. Each had a name, though he rarely spoke them aloud. Names mattered, but silence mattered more. He gave a low whistle, and they looked up. That was enough. He sat again, this time on the low stone wall that bordered the meadow. It was old, crumbling in places, but still strong. He had helped rebuild it once with his grandfather, whose hands were like bark, and whose voice could calm storms. That was many, many winters ago. He ran his hand over the cool stone and watched the flock graze. A lamb bleated softly. Wind rustled the grass, and somewhere high above, the first sliver of sun pierced the clouds. He smiled. There was no rush. This day, like all days in the misty mountains, would unfold slowly, like a leaf opening to light, and Alden would be here to witness it, as he always had, as he always would. It did not scatter the mist. It only warmed it slightly, giving the hills a soft golden glow, as if the entire mountain had been brushed with honey. Alden sat quietly on the wall, his cloak wrapped tightly around him, his eyes half-lidded with peace. The sheep grazed near him now, some lying in the wet grass, others chewing contentedly. They were creatures of habit. So was he. From his pocket, he drew out a small piece of wood and a knife with a bone handle. He began to carve, not hurriedly, not even purposefully, just letting the blade whisper against the grain, shaving away thin curls that fell silently to the ground. He had carved for years, not for art, not for trade, just to keep his hands busy while his mind wandered through old paths. Today, he carved a bird, not a raven, not a hawk, something simpler. A songbird he once saw as a boy, bright yellow with a call like a flute. He hadn't seen one in years. Perhaps they no longer come this high. Perhaps he no longer looked hard enough. He smiled as he carved the beak. He remembered how his mother used to hum to the birds outside the cottage window. She believed they brought messages of change, of health, of visitors. She had been a small woman with strong hands and eyes full of stories. Her voice had been soft, but her presence firm as mountain stone. When she died, he buried her on the south hill where the wildflowers bloomed in spring. He still placed stones on her grave each year, one for every season she had lived through. The blade caught for a moment in the wood, and he paused. A gust of wind swept down from the higher ridge, and with it came a low sound, distant, rhythmic, almost like chanting. Not human voices, not wind. It was the old song of the mountains, creaking branches, shifting earth, water trickling beneath stone. Alden closed his eyes and listened. He could almost hear footsteps, not real ones, but memories, the echo of generations walking this very path. His grandfather's boots, his father's slower steps, his own once swift and careless, now measured and careful.
This mountain remembered them all. He opened his eyes and looked west, toward the path that led to the summit. He rarely climbed it now. The trail was steep, the air thin, and his knees not what they used to be. But today, something in the wind stirred him. He stood. With a quiet whistle, he called the sheep closer, guiding them with his staff toward the inner fold, a low enclosure of stones where they could rest while he wandered. They knew the place well and settled in without protest. He filled the old trough from his water skin, gave them a nod, and turned toward the higher trail. It rose steeply between outcrops of granite, winding through groves of bent pines and scattered boulders. Moss clung to every shaded stone. Snow still dusted the highest crags, though the season was turning. He moved slowly, one step at a time, his breath steady, his staff tapping out a rhythm against the stone. As he climbed, the mist thickened again, wrapping him in white. The world shrank to the space around his body. It was not frightening, it was familiar, like walking through a dream he had dreamed 100 times. He passed the stone where his father had once tied an offering of braided cord, years ago, after surviving a winter storm. The cord had long since rotted away, but the memory remained. He passed the broken tree where lightning had struck when he was a child. He had hidden under that very tree, trembling with his dog while the storm roared like a god across the ridge. And then he reached the ridge itself. The mist parted slightly, revealing the full sweep of the mountain valley. It was breathtaking, not because it was dramatic, but because it was endless. Layers upon layers of hills, soft and green, flowing into each other like waves frozen in place. He stood there, breathing it in. The wind was colder here. He tightened his cloak and walked along the narrow spine of the ridge until he reached the stone cairn at its highest point. He had helped build it many years ago, carrying stones in his pack each season, stacking them with care and prayers. It was tradition. Every shepherd added a stone. He pulled a flat, smooth rock from the inside pocket of his cloak. He had chosen it weeks ago. It was pale gray, speckled with white, like winter sky. He placed it carefully on top of the cairn. Then he sat. There were no words needed here, only presence. The clouds shifted above, and the sun broke through for a brief moment, casting golden light across the hills. The stones glowed, the mist sparkled like silver dust. Alden felt warmth on his face and closed his eyes. He remembered his daughter's laughter echoing down the slope. He remembered the sound of lambs calling in spring. He remembered how the wind smelled before rain. He remembered the first time he was trusted with the flock, the weight of it both terrifying and sacred. And he remembered sitting here, years ago, with his own father, quiet, watching, breathing. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. The wind rose again. It did not howl, it hummed, a song of stones and seasons, a song of breath and bone, a song of home. Alden smiled, his eyes still closed. He did not feel old. He did not feel young. He simply felt here, and that was enough. The wind quieted once more, soft as a lullaby. Alden sat beside the cairn for a long time. Time in the mountains was not counted in hours, but in light, shadow, and the rhythm of breath. And so, as the mist curled again around the stones and the golden sunlight slipped behind the veil of clouds, Alden rose slowly, his staff steady in his hand. He cast one last glance across the valley. There were no villages in sight, no towers, no roads, no smoke from other hearths, just the gentle curve of the hills, the dark arms of forests, and the endless, breathing fog. A world untouched, a world that remembered him.
The descent was easier. His feet found their familiar rhythm, like footsteps in a song long known by heart. The birds called once or twice from the trees. A squirrel darted across the path, leaving tiny trails in the moss. The trees swayed, but made no sound. When he reached the lower trail again, the mist had thinned just enough to reveal the sheep waiting patiently in the fold. They looked up as he returned, bells chiming faintly. A few stepped closer, brushing against his cloak. He chuckled, low and warm. "I didn't forget you," he said softly. "Not today." He opened the fold and let them wander freely once more. The flock scattered gently over the hillside, picking their way through the dew-covered grass. He followed at a distance, watching, listening, breathing. Later, as the sky began to deepen into dusk, he guided them back toward the cottage. The sun dipped behind the peaks, casting long blue shadows across the ground. The mist began its slow return, folding over the grass and stones like a blanket. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the stone cottage smelled of wood smoke, wool, and pine. The hearth still held a few warm embers from the morning. He knelt beside it, feeding it kindling until the flames stirred and grew. A soft orange glow lit the single room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with carved figures, small stones, bundles of dried herbs, and folded wool blankets. The table held a kettle,
an old wooden bowl, and a loaf of coarse brown bread wrapped in cloth. He moved through the motions of the evening with practiced grace, filling the kettle, slicing cheese, lighting the small oil lamp on the windowsill. Outside, the mist pressed against the glass, wrapping the world in silence once more. He ate slowly. The bread was dense but soft, the cheese sharp, the water cold and clean. He took no more than he needed and left the rest, wrapped as always. Afterward, he settled into his chair beside the hearth. It creaked beneath him, familiar and comforting. His hands rested in his lap. The fire crackled softly. He did not speak. He did not need to. He looked around the room, not to see, but to remember. There, on the wall, hung his father's old cloak, threadbare, faded, still carrying the scent of mountain wind. On the shelf above the hearth sat a small wooden box. Inside were his daughter's letters, worn and folded from many readings. The carved bird he had made earlier rested beside them now, unfinished, its wings still tucked. He reached for a thick wool blanket and pulled it over his legs. The warmth settled over him like memory. Outside, the sheep were quiet in the fold. The mist clung to the cottage, wrapping it in stillness. Alden leaned back. He listened to the crackle of the fire, to the faint bell of a distant sheep, to the hush of the world, and above all, to the sound that was not a sound, the breath of the mountain. Slow, endless, alive. He closed his eyes. He saw the trail again, the cairn, the ridge, the bird. He saw his mother smiling in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour. His father mending a fence in the snow. His daughter chasing lambs through the spring meadow. His dog, old and gray, resting beside his boots. They weren't ghosts. They were echoes. And echoes in these mountains never really faded.
They simply folded into the mist. Alden's breath slowed. Outside, the wind shifted once more, curling around the stone walls, whistling gently through the cracks. Inside, the fire dimmed to a soft glow. And in his chair, wrapped in wool and silence, Alden drifted into sleep. No words, no farewell, just peace. The mountains watched, unmoving. The mist held him gently, and the night, as it always had, whispered him home. It was a windless night when Elliot, the old lighthouse keeper, lit the lantern atop the gray tower for the 1,000th time. The sea stretched silent and endless beneath him, a sheet of ink pierced only by moonlight and the faint glimmer of stars. The waves, though ever moving, made no sound against the jagged coast. They merely shifted, swelling and sinking, like the breath of something ancient and asleep. The lighthouse stood on the edge of the world, or so Elliot always thought of it. The cliff upon which it perched was high, worn and beaten by centuries of storms. The path that led to it was narrow and winding, flanked by wind-twisted pines and moss-covered stones. Few walked it now. Fewer still had ever lived to tell stories of it. Elliot had walked it nearly every day for 40 years. Each night, without fail, he would climb the spiral staircase within the tower. 137 steps, his boots clicking on the old iron. At the top, beneath the massive glass dome, he would strike a match, light the great flame, and let its beam stretch out across the water. He never asked why anymore. The ships had long stopped coming. The harbor below had long been abandoned. But still, he lit the lantern, because that was what lighthouse keepers did, and Elliot was the last of them. He stood now at the top, watching as the flame caught, flickered, then roared into brilliance. The great lens began to turn, slow and steady, casting its long eye out into the dark. Below, the sea stirred slightly. The wind teased the rocks. Somewhere in the far distance, a gull cried once, then was silent. Elliot placed a hand on the railing, rough with salt and rust. He breathed deeply. The air smelled of kelp and memory, of time forgotten and time still waiting. He stayed there for a long moment, then turned and began his descent. The tower creaked faintly as he walked. The stairs spoke to him in groans and sighs, each one different, familiar. He greeted them like old friends. "Evening, step 32. I see you are still complaining." He chuckled to himself, a sound barely louder than the breeze outside. At the base of the tower, he stepped into the small stone cottage that had been his home for decades. Its walls were thick, its hearth always warm. Shelves lined the room, filled with books, journals, old compasses, glass bottles, worn wool blankets. On the far wall, a weathered map of the coastline hung beneath a brass lantern. He poured himself a cup of tea, strong, dark, slightly bitter, and sat by the window. The sea stared back at him.
Not in menace, not in affection, just in presence. He sipped. The candle on the table flickered in the breeze sneaking through the window frame. Outside, the great beam of the lighthouse swept slowly across the horizon. Elliot watched its rhythm, steady and calm. In the early years, he had written letters. He had sent messages to the town far inland, updates, requests for supplies, stories. Sometimes they replied, sometimes not. Eventually, he stopped sending them. The sea, he found, was a better listener. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him, and listened now, not just to the ocean, but to the silence it offered. It wasn't emptiness, it was space, a room within the world where thoughts could stretch out and breathe. He closed his eyes and remembered. Elliot remembered the first time he arrived at the lighthouse. He had been young then, only 24, with eyes full of sky and salt. His boots were new, his hands were uncalloused. The old keeper before him, a man named Marin, had welcomed him with little more than a nod and a mug of hot stew. "No words needed," Marin had said. "The sea teaches in silence." Elliot hadn't understood then. Not really, but he had nodded and stayed. And in time, the silence had spoken. It spoke in wind patterns, in the shifting weight of fog, in the whisper of ropes against dock poles, long after the boats had gone. Now, so many years later, Elliot walked those same paths as if they had grown out of his own feet. The coastline knew him. The tower knew him. Even the waves, he sometimes thought, rose differently when he watched. On that particular night, after finishing his tea, Elliot stood and lit his small oil lamp. Its flame danced gently, casting golden arcs across the stone walls. He moved toward the back of the cottage, where a narrow hallway led to a storage room, and beyond it, the small library he had built over the years. Books lined every inch of the walls, not organized alphabetically or by subject, but by feel, by memory. Nautical charts sat beside poems. Weather journals rested against old philosophy volumes. There were even children's stories, yellowed at the edges, kept for no particular reason, except that they made him smile. He pulled a book at random and sat in the high-backed chair near the window. Outside, the sea pulsed like a sleeping giant. The great beam of the lighthouse swung across the waves in its eternal arc. He read for a while, but his eyes wandered more than his thoughts. Eventually, the words blurred, and he closed the book, setting it aside. The room darkened slightly as the clouds moved across the moon. Elliot watched the shadows shift on the floor. Then he rose, crossed the room, and opened a small wooden drawer in the desk beneath the window. Inside, wrapped in a bit of faded cloth, was a pocket watch. Old, bronze, slightly tarnished.
It no longer kept time. Hadn't for years. But it had belonged to Marin. The old keeper had left it behind the night he disappeared. No one ever found him. The boat was still tied to the dock. The light had still been lit, but Marin was simply gone. Elliot had waited 3 days before reporting it to the Coast Guard. He had half expected Marin to return, drenched and grumbling, some tale of a wrecked dinghy or a sudden storm. But he never did. The authorities searched for a week. Then they left, and Elliot became the new keeper. He turned the watch over in his hand now. Its surface was smooth from years of touch. The back was engraved with a single word: listen. He had never asked what it meant. And now, all these years later, he wasn't sure he needed to. He returned the watch to the drawer and closed it gently. Back in the main room, he stoked the fire in the hearth, letting it flare into a soft, steady warmth. The flames danced like spirits, casting stories against the stone walls. He sat once more. Outside, the clouds began to break, revealing more of the stars. Iliad often thought of them as ships, not vessels of war or trade, but great silent travelers, making their way across the dark. No flags, no ports, just the long arc of movement, steady, patient, eternal. He reached for his journal. The leather was cracked, the pages nearly full. He opened to the last blank sheet and began to write. The beam moved quietly tonight. The sea was still. I thought I heard a voice in the fog, but it was only the gulls, or memory, or both. The past is close these days, like fog pressed against the glass. Perhaps tomorrow I'll open the cellar. He stopped writing, stared at the last line. The cellar. He hadn't opened it in years, not since the storm, not since the night the whisper came through the stones. He closed the journal and set it down beside the lamp. Then he leaned back. The sea whispered, the wind turned, and the lighthouse watched. Morning came slowly on the coast. The sky was pale and heavy with mist. The sea, though never truly asleep, stirred only slightly beneath a blanket of fog so dense it erased the horizon. Even the light from the tower, still turning, still glowing, seemed hesitant to cut through the haze. Elliot rose before the sun, as he always did. He didn't need an alarm. The rhythm of the sea was enough.
He made tea, the same blend he had drunk since the 70s. Strong, dark, earthy. He drank it with both hands wrapped around the mug, sitting by the same window where he'd watched countless sunrises filter slowly through the clouds. But this morning, he didn't look outside. His eyes were fixed on the wooden door in the corner of the cottage. The cellar door. Its hinges were black with age, the iron handle slightly loose. Dust had gathered in the corners where the door met the floor, untouched for years. And yet, this morning, Elliot felt it calling. Not loudly, not urgently, just gently. A suggestion, a hum. He set the mug down and crossed the room. He reached for the handle. It turned with a creak, as if waking from a long sleep. He opened the door slowly, and the scent of earth, salt, and iron drifted up. The stairs descended into darkness, not cold or cruel darkness, but old darkness. Patient, watching. He lit a lantern and began to descend. The steps groaned beneath his boots, not in protest, but in recognition. The cellar hadn't changed. Stone walls, packed earth floor, shelves filled with old supplies, tools, canned food, ropes, nets, weathered books, and storm lanterns that hadn't been lit in decades. Cobwebs hung like lace from the ceiling beams. And in the far corner, beneath a heavy canvas tarp, something waited. He crossed the room slowly. Kneeling, he pulled the tarp back. The edges were stiff with age, but the fabric yielded. Beneath it sat a wooden chest. Old, heavy, oak, bound in iron. He had almost forgotten it. Almost. He placed a hand on the lid. The surface was cool, dust-covered, but smooth. No lock. Just a single carved symbol at the center, a circle of waves surrounding a crescent moon. It wasn't his. It had been Marin's. The old keeper had brought it with him when he first arrived. Elliot remembered helping him carry it down the path from the boat all those years ago. He had asked what was inside. Marin had only smiled. Things that belong to the sea, he had said. Elliot lifted the lid. Inside, everything was neatly arranged. Cloth bundles, small sealed jars, a compass, a journal wrapped in oilskin, and at the very bottom, something wrapped in velvet the color of midnight. He picked it up carefully. It was heavy, but not large, about the size of a closed fist. He unwrapped the velvet slowly. Inside was a sphere. Glass, or something like it. Dark, but not opaque, it shimmered faintly like moonlight behind smoke. He held it to the lantern. Inside the sphere, tiny silver flecks swirled, not drifting like snow in a globe, but moving with intent, like a living current. Elliot stared into it, and for a moment, the room was gone. The stone walls vanished. The lantern's glow faded, and he stood on a cliff not his own, beneath a sky filled with stars he did not recognize. The wind roared around him, waves crashed far below, and someone stood beside him. Not Marin, not a memory. Someone else. Tall, cloaked, face hidden in the shadows. No voice came, but a thought passed between them, clear as breath on glass. The light must remain. Then the world returned. The cellar, the lantern, the chest. Elliot sat back, breathing slowly, the sphere still in his hands. He placed it gently on the cloth and wrapped it again. Then, carefully, he opened Marin's journal. The pages crackled slightly as he turned them. The handwriting was tight, looping, weathered by sea air. Most of the entries were normal enough. Weather patterns, repairs, small observations. Until he reached the final page. There were only 6 words. The sea forgets, but not always. Elliot read them again,
and again. Then he closed the book and sat in the dark for a long time. The lighthouse beam passed overhead, sending a muted flash across the cellar ceiling. He stood, took the sphere, the journal, and the compass, and brought them upstairs. The cottage felt different now. Not darker, just deeper, as though a door had opened, not in the floor, but in time. Elliot placed the items gently on the table near the window. Then he sat and listened. The wind shifted, the tide pulled, and somewhere, far below the surface of the ocean, something stirred. Not awake, not dreaming, just remembering. That night, Elliot did not sleep. He sat in his armchair beside the window, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, the wrapped sphere and the old journal resting on the table at his side. Outside, the fog had returned, pressing itself against the glass like a soft hand from another world. The lighthouse beam continued its rotation, silent and eternal, cutting through the mist with each pass. Inside the cottage, all was still. He watched the sea until his eyes grew heavy, then closed them, not to sleep, but to listen. There was a rhythm to the ocean, not just in its waves, but in its memory. He had heard it in dreams, low hums, deep pulses, the breath of something older than time. Sometimes he imagined the ocean was not water at all, but a language, a slow, forgotten tongue, still murmuring to those who dared remain quiet enough to hear. He opened his eyes again and reached for the journal. Marin's last line echoed in his mind. The sea forgets, but not always. What had he meant? Had Marin seen something in the sphere? Had he heard voices too? Elliot stood and moved to the small writing desk near the hearth. He opened his own journal to a fresh page and dipped his pen in ink. His hand hovered over the paper for a long time before he began to write. Tonight, the sea feels full of eyes, not watching with malice, not with kindness, just watching. The glass sphere pulses when I touch it, not with heat, not with light, with memory. I wonder how many keepers before Marin carried it. I wonder if it remembers them all. He paused. Outside, a faint cry broke the silence. A gull? A seal? Or something else? He didn't move, only listened.
Nothing followed. He set the pen down and returned to the table. Carefully, he unwrapped the sphere once more. It was slightly warm now, not uncomfortably, but distinctly. The silver particles inside still swirled, forming shapes that almost resolved, then drifted apart again. He held it closer. And again, the world fell away. But this time, he did not stand on the cliff. He was beneath the waves. The water surrounded him, but did not suffocate. It cradled him, infinite and dark, alive with lightless movement. Shapes floated nearby, vast and slow, their edges indistinct, like memories moving through dreams. And ahead, in the far distance, something glowed. A structure. A tower, like his lighthouse, but not built of stone or iron. It was alive. Its walls pulsed like the chambers of a heart. Its light was not flame, but thought. He drifted closer. And then, a voice. Not spoken aloud, but felt. The light is not only to warn, it is to remember. Elliot gasped. He was back in the cottage, the sphere still in his hands, its surface dim again. The fire in the hearth had died down to embers. The candle on the table had burned low. The room was quiet, but different. Heavier somehow, not with fear, but with presence. He stood slowly and placed the sphere back on the cloth, wrapping it carefully. Then he returned to the journal and added only one line more. The light is memory. In the morning, he rose as usual. He lit the lantern at the top of the tower, checked the oil levels, inspected the lens, then descended again, his steps slower than usual, each one measured, like steps within a temple. He spent the afternoon walking the path along the cliff edge. The wind was gentle. The sea below churned softly, speaking in tongues he could nearly understand. He paused at a point where the stone jutted out farthest into the sea. There, long ago, he had found a pile of stacked stones, small cairns built by hands unknown, now mostly toppled by time and weather. He knelt and rebuilt one. Not large, just 5 stones, balanced and quiet. When he finished, he sat beside it, gazing out to the endless horizon. He whispered to the wind, unsure if the words were his or the sea's. I remember now.
That night, the fog came earlier, thicker. It rolled in before sunset, swallowing the world in soft gray silence. Elliot lit the lantern early. He watched as the beam turned, steady as breath, sweeping the mist in long arcs of golden light. And for the first time in years, he wondered if someone, something, might be watching for it. Not ships, not men, but memories drifting across the dark sea, searching for home. The following days passed like a gentle tide. Each morning, Elliot rose before the light, made his tea, and walked the spiral stairs to ignite the lantern. Each evening, he sat by the window, watching the fog roll in like a soft blanket across the world. But something had shifted inside him. Not drastically, not in fear, in awareness. The tower, once only stone and iron, now felt like a pulse in the land. The light no longer seemed simply a beam to cut through fog, but a memory reaching into darkness. And Elliot, alone as ever, no longer felt lonely. He felt accompanied. The sphere remained on the table near the window, wrapped carefully, waiting. He didn't touch it again, not yet. But he often caught himself staring at it as the lantern beam passed overhead, its wrapped shape casting a soft, curved shadow on the wood. One evening, after a day of cold drizzle, Elliot returned from his walk soaked and thoughtful. The path along the cliff had been slick, but the wind had whispered something to him. A rhythm, a word, a name? He couldn't quite hold it in his mind, but he wrote it anyway in his journal, half legible, half faded in the ink. Eilithin. He didn't know what it meant, but he dreamed of it that night. In the dream, he stood not on his own cliff, but on the balcony of the strange, living tower from the vision beneath the waves.
Its walls throbbed gently with a light like breathing starlight. And beside him stood a figure, tall, wrapped in sea-gray robes, face smooth as stone, eyes full of stars. They spoke without moving their mouth. "You tend the last flame. The others are dark, but one remains, and it remembers." Eliot woke with tears in his eyes, not from sorrow, but from recognition. The next morning, he prepared the small boat tied behind the tower. He hadn't used it in years. Its hull was old, worn by salt, but still strong. He cleaned the inside, patched a cracked board, and sealed the seams with resin. Then he set it back beneath the stone overhang near the shoreline and waited. He wasn't sure for what, but he felt he would know when the time came. Later that evening, just after lighting the lantern and descending into the cottage, Eliot paused before the fireplace. He stared at the empty stone above the mantel where a portrait used to hang. His father, also a lighthouse keeper, though on another shore far away, long lost to time. The frame had fallen in a storm 20 winters ago. He never replaced it. But tonight, he thought of his father's eyes, clear, deep, and always watching the horizon. He imagined him sitting beside him now, sipping tea, nodding slowly at the turning light. Eliot smiled. Outside, the wind began to rise. It wasn't a storm wind, no howl, no rage. It was a breath, a summoning. He opened the drawer, removed the sphere, unwrapped it, and placed it in the center of the table. It shimmered faintly as always, but this time it pulsed. Once, twice, then softly like a heartbeat settling into rhythm. Eliot leaned close, and this time he did not fall into vision. He heard a voice, soft as water against stone. "Keeper of the last memory, the sea has trusted you long, but it is time to pass the flame." He blinked slowly. The sphere dimmed again. The room was unchanged. The wind outside pressed gently at the windows. He wrote in his journal, "It is not only light we guard, it is remembering. Not facts, not history, feeling, breath. The sea once knew every soul that crossed it. I think it still does, and the lighthouse is its way of never forgetting." That night, Eliot did not sleep. He prepared a satchel with care. The sphere, the journal, the compass from Marin's chest, a bundle of dried herbs, and a carved figure of a ship, and a single unlit lantern. Then he sat by the fire, cloak wrapped around his shoulders, hands calm. The beam above continued its turning. Outside, the fog was dense and silver. The sea was waiting. Before dawn, the sky was dark with velvet blue. The stars, one by one, dimmed behind the thick mist that clung to the sea and cliffs. The waves moved gently below, brushing the stone with a sound like slow breath. No gulls cried, no wind spoke. It was as if the world itself held its breath. Eliot stood at the edge of the dock behind the lighthouse. The boat rocked softly in the tide. The satchel was packed. The lantern, unlit, sat in the prow. The sphere, wrapped again in midnight velvet, rested near his heart. He looked once more at the lighthouse, the tower of stone and glass that had been his companion for most of his life. Its beam turned slowly above, casting wide arcs through the morning fog. It felt like a farewell, but not a sorrowful one. The sea, the light, and the silence had prepared him well.
He stepped into the boat. The rope was untied with ease. The small vessel drifted away from the dock, oars silent in the water. He didn't row far, just enough to let the land fall behind him in the fog. Then he stopped rowing and let the sea guide him. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time felt loose now, like a tide that no longer followed the moon. And then the mist shifted, not parted, not blown away. It simply changed, became thinner, luminous. And ahead through that shimmering veil, Elliot saw it. A light, faint, flickering. Not the beam of his lighthouse, but something older, lower. A flame, golden and deep, floating just above the water surface. He reached toward it and found himself not in the boat, but standing on stone. Beneath him a platform rose from the sea, smooth and black as obsidian, shaped not by men, but by memory itself. And the flame, it hovered still, dancing in a bowl made of glass and bone. Elliot stepped closer. The satchel hung at his side. He opened it and removed the velvet-wrapped sphere. Slowly, gently, he unwrapped it and placed it beside the flame. The flame didn't react. It didn't grow or shrink. It simply recognized. The two lights, fire and memory, met. And for a moment, everything was still. Then, the flame moved. It leaned into the sphere and entered it. Without sound, without heat. The sphere glowed once, softly, like breath on a cold window, then dimmed again. The obsidian platform began to fall, not with speed, but with certainty. Elliot felt no fear, only motion. And then, he was back in the boat, the satchel empty, the sea calm, the mist rolling back slowly. He looked behind him, and the lighthouse stood, quiet, still. But its light, it had changed, no longer golden, now silver blue, like moonlight on deep water. It turned slowly, casting its new hue into the dark. He rowed back. The boat touched the dock. He stepped out, tied it gently, and climbed the path. The grass wet with dew whispered beneath his boots. He reached the door, entered, lit the fire, hung his cloak.